Joining me now is Tom Mulcair, CTV News political commentator and former NDP leader. Tom, good to see you.
Good morning, Renee.
So, less than a day before the trade deal deadline, what do you make of Donald Trump's threat after Carney's Palestinian statehood announcement?
This is a direct attack on Canadian sovereignty. Let's not kid ourselves. Whether or not Canada can actually have its own foreign policy is at the heart of the most recent bluster from Donald Trump. He puts out on Truth Social, oh, wow, Canada is saying that it's going to recognize a Palestinian state. By the way, a two-state solution has been part of Canadian foreign policy for decades, and that will make it very difficult to have a trade deal. This is an attempt to use a trade negotiation as a way to control Canada's independent foreign policy. And no matter where Canadians are on the issue of the recognition of a Palestinian state, and I think that it's a big open discussion, is this the right time? Those things are on the table in Canada. But nobody in another country, the United States or anywhere else, can tell Canada what it should or should not do in terms of recognition of a Palestinian state. So it's, as usual with Trump, there's a lot of bluster. It's ham-fisted. It's a punch in the face. It's an attempt to say, no, we in the United States will dictate to Canada what your foreign policy is. And of course, that's not on. Again, this is an open debate here in Canada. People come down on different sides of this. It's a fraught issue, but it comes at a time, as Carney said correctly, when an entire civilian population is being starved, and Canada is saying, we're going to be part of the move to finally recognize a Palestinian state, because the recognition of a Palestinian state has been part of Canadian foreign policy for decades, and now is the time. Trump thinks he can play a role in that he can actually control it and use these trade negotiations as a hammer to try to break Canada's will on this. I don't think it's going to work. I think quite the contrary, Canadians are going to be very offended by this most recent attempt. Renee, when the United States said that the negotiations were off because of Canada's digital services tax, that was a trade issue. And Canada pulled back from the imposition of that particular tax because it did affect American companies, big ones, first and foremost. And Canada withdrew it simply to get back to the bargaining table, and because otherwise we would have been collecting the tax to perhaps remit it, because we would have eventually had to give in on that. What happened was Trump boasted that Canada had caved. Those were his words. He boasted out loud, you see, Canada just caved. Well, on this issue, even though it's a big discussion here in Canada, there's no possibility now for Mark Carney to withdraw that position. It was entirely predictable that Donald Trump would try to use his bully pulpit to push back on Canada. The Americans don't agree with this decision. We knew in advance that they would not agree with it. But at the same time, Carney and the people around him said, we're not going to take the chance of this coming up later. And then Trump saying, well, it's a deal breaker. It's got to be clear from the start that Canada has an independent foreign policy. We will exercise our full sovereignty, even when the United States disagrees with it, as it did, for example, on the Iraq War. They weren't happy with us. Too bad. This is an independent country, sovereign nation that has its ability to come up with its own policies.
The big question, Tom, will this affect trade negotiations between Canada and the U.S.? Do you believe Trump when he implies that it's going to make it harder to make a deal?
It's an attempt by the Americans to claim that it'll make it harder to make a deal, and it is the 11th hour because this is the deadline that Trump himself had set. But at the same time, there's no possible way for Canada to blink on this. Trump is playing his usual negotiating game. He pushes everything to the center of the table. Fine. But what he's done is he's put a spotlight on something that could have been discussed perhaps in terms of timing otherwise. But now that he's done that, he's made it clear that Canada can never back away. And so it's a bit of a mug's game that he's playing right now. It's typical Trump. It's always bluster. It's always the con job. It's always the negotiating tactic. But there will be a trade deal of some sort at some point between Canada and the United States because our economies are so intertwined. He came out with something on copper the other day, big Canadian export, billions and billions of dollars. He completely backed away from it today. So this is Trump. He's always trying to look for an angle, saying, well, it's not my fault. It's Canada's recognizing the Palestinian state that's the real problem, so there might not be a deal because of what Canada's doing. This is a trade negotiation. Trump is a lifelong con man, trickster and carnival huckster, and he's going to use every trick in his bag. And it's a very deep set of tricks that he's got to try to push back against Canada. I don't think that Canada has the slightest option at this point to review what Carney has just said, that we're on the same track as Great Britain, as France, and as other very close allies of the United States. It's interesting, Renee, that it didn't stop the Americans from making a trade deal with Europe, even though key countries like France and now Great Britain, they didn't suffer anything when they said they were going to recognize a Palestinian state. So this is pure Trump trying to push back, trying to get an angle, trying to get an advantage with a trading partner and with a negotiating adversary. And Canada has no choice at this stage but to stick to its guns.
All right, we will have to leave it there. Thank you very much for your time today, Tom. As always, that is CTV News political commentator and former NDP leader Tom Mulcair.